Well, I got through the first obstacle. I didn't play Aaron's drums. I didn't fall on them. Next obstacle is stay on the seat. So, appreciate your prayers. I want us to take a moment and think about all the people that you know, that you've met through your lifetime. Now, how many of those people were genuine? Or how many of them were not genuine? How many of them may be two-faced? They'll tell you one thing, maybe agree with you, then they go and do something completely different. Or tell somebody else different. You tell them a secret, please keep it, please pray on it, and they go and tell somebody else. I think we've all met people like that in different ways. Some people are just downright two-faced. I shamefully tell you this story because at a church that I attended, there was an elder that I trusted. And I would go to this elder ever so often with concerns about the congregation or things that are going on. And he often agreed with me. Then he got in a board meeting or elders meeting and went completely to the opposite direction. That happened several times, and I lost confidence in that elder. And then I went to a different elder. He was a professional that needed to hold things in confidence. And I'd go to him and tell him things, and he'd agree with me also many times, and not every time, but agree with me. And then he'd get into an elder meeting or board meeting, and sometimes voted the way that we talked about. Sometimes he didn't. Now, here's the difference between those two elders. The first elder never came back and explained why he voted the other way or went with the other side. The second elder always came back, always explained to me the situation or why he voted the other way. Now, which of those two elders do you think I respected the most? It wasn't the need to agree. It was the fact that the second elder came to explain. He'd ride the combine seat, he'd ride the tractor seat, and made sure that I understood why he went the other direction. And it always made sense. Good of the congregation, the good of the church. It meant a lot. But how many people do we know that are not genuine in many different ways? Well, you can probably think of a few. Hopefully, not very many. But ask yourself this question. Are you a person who is genuine in love and kindness? That's what we're getting at this morning. How well do? We can't control other people. But you can control you, and I can control me. And that's what we're after this morning. And what we're looking at this morning is two people that were truly genuine with each other. Love and grace. Love and grace is our topic for today. Now, we continue with our series that we started on Ruth last week. And if you remember, Ruth and her husband Elimelech and their two sons left Bethlehem because there was a famine in the land. They went to the other side of the Red Sea, quite a journey, and lived in Moab, where Elimelech died. So now Naomi is by herself with two sons. The two sons married, and the two sons died. Now you have Naomi in a foreign land with two foreign women, her daughters-in-laws, and they love each other. So that's good. It's a good story except for the heartache and the heartbreak of it. And finally, the famine in Bethlehem is over, so Naomi told her daughters-in-law, go back to your Moabite families. You can marry again, you can raise children, you can live a happy life. And her one daughter-in-law, Orpah, went back. But Ruth insisted, I'm going with you. I am going to stick with you, Naomi. Your God will be my God. So we begin reading Ruth chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now for some reason, the author of this book skips from the story of Ruth and Naomi going back to Bethlehem and immediately goes to the story, gives some information on Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. So in the family there, which was good, who is Boaz? Well, we're not told exactly, but some things that we can kind of conclude from what we're seeing here. It appears he was wealthy. He had many servants, it sounds like. He was a landowner, quite a bit of land possibly. Not an ordinary man. The Bible says a man of standing. That gives him a little bit more prestige in people's eyes. He was a man of stature in the community. He was had a certain amount of power and authority in the community, as what we'll see coming up later. Now, what's interesting, most Bible characters, we always find a flaw. I mean, they're a great hero, and eventually they fail in some way. Bible people aren't perfect. We aren't perfect. But what's amazing is there are very, very few people in the Bible that God doesn't reveal a flaw. And with Boaz, we don't see any flaws. Not perfect. There's flaws in his armor, we're certain. Problems in his personal life, we're certain. But the Bible doesn't reveal any, which was really unusual for any person in the Bible. So remember that Boaz has stature. He has power. He's of honorable reputation. He's a man of competence, a master of himself and those under him. He's a reputable character. Valor, boldness, honor. He's a godly man. And that's important. And what we see of him in this narrative, it's godliness. So really a great person to know. Verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, what we want to point out here is the huge contrast between these women and Boaz. Ruth and Naomi are 180 degrees opposite of Boaz in so many ways. Naomi has nothing to her name. We don't know where she was living. Is this the house that her and Elimelech had that had been vacant for 10 years? We don't know. So we're not told, but it's likely, given her state of finances and everything, she's probably very, very, very poor. Poverty level, no money, no stature. Possibly the only thing she has on her to her name is the clothes on her back. Bible doesn't tell us where she lives. In Bethlehem, that's it. Probably not under the best of conditions. Naomi is destitute. How about Ruth? She's even in worse shape than what Naomi is. She's a foreigner. She's a Moabite. Now remember, this story, this narrative of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. Do you remember one of our stories in Judges that some of you didn't like? The fact that Ehud was the judge. And the king of the Moabites, the enemy, was this big old fat dude. And Ehud stuck his sword in his belly. Remember that story? Yeah. The Moabites are the enemies of Israel, at least during that time period. So this story takes place sometime during the time of the Judges. And at one point, Ruth was part of the enemy. We don't know exactly when. She has nothing. She's a fish out of water. Technically, she's homeless, except she's staying with her mother-in-law. And we mentioned Boaz's status. He's wealthy. He's well known in the community. He seems to have everything that he would want. And we're looking at two women that have nothing. Now, when you're looking at class status, that's a huge difference. Verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained there from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars and the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and homeland and came to live with people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." So now we see a little bit about both Boaz and Ruth. When Boaz came to the field, he greeted his workers with a blessing, and they replied back. Now remember, time during the Judges, there was a lot of godlessness, a lot of evil, a lot of wickedness. But here in this community of Bethlehem, it seemed like a bunch of godly people. Then we have Boaz asking about Ruth. Well, who is she? He was told that she asked permission to glean behind the harvesters. Now, what you have to understand is, that's an Old Testament law. You don't have to ask to glean behind harvesters. It was part of the Old Testament law that the poor people could go behind the harvesters and pick up the grain that was there. And the harvesters were not to harvest the field clean like we do today with our harvesters and the combines and the machines. There's not much left in the field. Back in the Old Testament time when they were doing the hand harvesting, they were not to take every stalk of grain. They were to leave a little bit behind. So asking permission, maybe it was a Moabite thing, but it was not an Israelite thing. She did not have to ask. So what I'm getting at is she was considerate of other people's property. She did the right thing to pay respect to the landowner, Boaz. And we know that word had spread concerning this Moabite woman, that Boaz had heard of her and maybe knew that they were related, whatever, but he was felt honored by how she had treated Naomi. And he invited her to stay in the fields, drink from the workers' water jugs. She didn't have to go someplace else, back into town to get a drink. He permitted her to drink alongside with his workers. Now, Boaz wasn't finished with his kindness. He offered her roasted grain. So she didn't have to go any place or thresh out her own grain. He offered her roasted grain so that she could sit and not just be satisfied. He gave her more grain than she could eat. And she had some left over. So we start to see the character of both Boaz and of Ruth. Verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So when Ruth returned to her mother-in-law, Naomi knew something was up. She knew enough that nobody can gather that much grain behind the harvesters. And so she found out then that Ruth was in her husband Elimelech's relative's field. And through the rest of the barley and wheat season then, Ruth stayed and worked in the fields of Boaz, not as a hired servant, but to glean behind the harvesters. Now, let's talk a little bit more about these two people. We need to understand this overwhelming godliness of Boaz. I'll put the point up, then we'll talk about it. Boaz lived in obedience to the heart of the law. Boaz lived in obedience to the heart of the law. Boaz went out of his way to be kind to Ruth, and it would seem that he would have treated many of the people in the fields the same way. He went beyond the letter of the law concerning Ruth. He told the men to leave her alone. Now, has anybody here ever been the odd person out in a group of workers? Or maybe you can remember your school days when all these cliques and maybe you weren't in the right clique. And you know, it can be rough. They call it the picking order. Chickens. They pick on the one that looks odd and looks different. And Boaz told his workers, leave her alone. He was protecting her, which says a lot about Boaz. He let Ruth pick with the other women, with his worker women. Another safe haven there. He provided water for Ruth. He gave her the roasted grain to eat, all that she could eat. He had his harvesters leave extra grain behind them on the ground. Hey, you guys, if you see Ruth coming behind you, leave a little extra laying there. That's okay. The Old Testament laws not only stated that the poor could go through the fields after the harvesters, but it also designated that the harvesters were not to harvest clear into the corners and even to the very edge of the field. So what we have to ask ourselves is, I wonder how much Boaz had his harvesters leave. If the letter of the law said, in English terms, you have to leave a foot of grain around the outside of the field. My guess is Boaz would have left quite a bit more than that. You're supposed to leave the corners. Don't go clear into the corners. Well, how much were they supposed to leave? See, if in our English version would say you gotta leave 3 feet out from the very corner. That would be the letter of the law. From Boaz, we can kind of get the idea. He left quite a bit more than that. See, there's a difference between living by the letter of the law and the heart of the law. Boaz treated his workers good, from what we're saying. If you don't like your boss, you don't give him a blessing when he or she comes into work. You hold a grudge. But Scripture seems to lend its information that Boaz treated this foreigner with love and kindness. We're guessing that Boaz went deeper than the letter of the law. Now, we go to the New Testament, of course, Boaz wouldn't have known this teaching. Matthew chapter 7, verse 9. Jesus says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, will give him a snake? If you, then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Now here's what we're after. Verse 12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Remember the people asked Jesus about eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. He said, no, that's not the idea. See, the letter of the law permits a certain amount of justice and vengeance. He said, no. Someone takes your cloak, go ahead, give it to him. Someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other to him also. That's going to the heart of the law, to loving your enemies, doing good to those who don't treat you good. So, be kind. Be kind only to class status. Be kind only to Americans. Be kind only to those of the color of their skin. You don't have to be kind to foreigners. Think about it. How do we look at people? How do we treat people? If someone doesn't look the way we'd like them to look, how do we treat them? Boaz lived by the heart of the law. So let's not overlook Ruth. Let's say this in a little bit different way in the love that she demonstrated. Ruth also lived beyond the letter of the law. Now it says the same thing as the last one. I'm just wording it different. Ruth lived beyond the letter of the law. She lived by the heart of the law, such as what Boaz did. She left her homeland, go with Naomi to her land. She left behind her false gods and took the Lord God, Naomi's God, as her God. The law did not require that she ask permission to harvest a field, but she still asked. She did not have to take all the grain home and share with Naomi, but she did. She simply did what needed done, and then she went farther than what needed done. She asked to pick up the grain, kindness to Naomi, kindness to Boaz. So when we live by the letter of the law, we might say that we're treating people unfairly. We're not treating them the way that Jesus would say that we should do it. Jesus wants us to live by the heart of the law and go beyond. You know, sometimes we see somebody, and, okay, we'll give them a chance. And when they make a mistake, aha! I knew it. You weren't worth it. You're fired. Get out of here. You're done. That's the letter of the law. Love and grace is giving them going to the heart of the law. And even when you give them love and grace, they're still going to make mistakes. Still going to be. So treating people with love and grace is living by the heart of the law. Naomi gave Ruth love and grace. Ruth gave Naomi love and grace. Boaz gave Ruth love and grace. Had no judgment on her race, her gender, her status in the community, near the complete bottom of the status of the community. Ruth gave Boaz love and grace. He had authority, all kinds of wealth, everything over her. She didn't have to treat him with love and grace, but yet she did. So here's a question for you. How do you see other people? How do you treat other people? Do you make unfair judgments? Then pounce on them if they slip up and prove you right? Do you give them a second chance? The story of Ruth and Boaz is a love story. But it's not the kind of love story that you're thinking yet. That'll come next week. The story of Boaz and Ruth is a story of love and grace. Now we have to wonder, did Boaz look at her as a potential wife in this chapter? I don't think he did. I think this was a wealthy man of status that saw a poor lady with no status and treated her as a sister, as a child of God. How would we do that? How would we do that? Do we cut people down? Are we judgmental? There are several love stories in the Bible. Of course, the greatest love story is that of Jesus and his sacrifice that he made for us so that we have salvation. But another love story of love and grace is that of David. Remember the story of David? Samuel was the last judge of Israel. God said Samuel, now he was also a prophet. God told Samuel, he said, go to the house of Jesse and choose the man that I tell you to be the second king of Israel, to replace Saul, who had sinned. So Samuel went to Jesse's house, and he said, okay, I need your sons out here. So Jesse lined his sons up. The Bible says some were handsome, some were strong. Samuel sees him. He said, oh, that's got to be the one. God said, nope, not him either. Not him either. Finally, Samuel went through all the sons. Samuel said, well, God didn't choose any of these. Do you have another son? Well, yeah, Jesse said, I got another son, but he's out shepherding in the field. The baby of the family. Let's just face it. Samuel said, go get him. Jesse came back, or somebody came back, but David probably sent one of his other sons, little scrawny rug rat. God says, him. He's the one. Why? Because David was a man after God's own heart. David understood love and grace. And of course, God understood love and grace. Now, David did mess up. Bathsheba, had her husband killed. David repented. He suffered the penalty, but he was still a man after God's own heart once he repented. And God showed him love and grace. So what's in your heart? Now, I've got a confession to make, and that is that I had this sermon all written. And somebody approached me later this last week, and they pointed out something that I had done, something that I had said. And I had no comeback, because they were right. Saying something in fun, I had deeply cut them, deeply offended them. I didn't realize it. And all while they're talking and telling me this, I'm thinking, I failed. Love and grace. I didn't show it. In what ways do we fail people? In what ways do we poke fun, thinking, well, it's funny to me, but it's not? How many ways do we stop somebody off? I don't have time for you. Love and grace. Love and grace. It's the way of Jesus. Now, as I conclude, I'm going to stay up here today, so I don't play Aaron's drums on the way down, and that I don't do a face plant on the floor. So if anybody has a decision to make, we're going to have one of our elders come down and they'll take care of you. So let's go to God in prayer.